immigration isn't only a hot topic in the United States. There's been public controversy over a recent proposal in Canada to create a new class of refugees called mass arrival. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. Canada is actually one of the most open countries in the world in terms of immigration. It accepts large numbers of immigrants and seems to have done quite well integrating them. This particular issue has arisen because on boats you have large numbers of people twice this year who have arrived in Canada, the so-called mass arrivals. The problem, of course, is that these groups of people put incredible strains on the immigration system because they all make refugee claims which have to be assessed in a relatively quick period of times, at least initially. Now, this act would have allowed the government to take more time to process them and in the meantime detain people who are arguing for refugee status and who are arriving usually on boats. I mean, the true problem behind this is really one that has to do with probably larger questions of development and division of wealth in the world. Because what you're really facing is a question of why are people coming? And as Western countries have made it ever more difficult for people to come, you have seen large smuggling networks develop. You've seen this in Latin America, you see it in Asia. And the problem is the only people benefiting from all of this, from this whole gestalt, are smuggling networks. And in many respects, what the Canadian government is trying to do is get at the smuggling networks, but doing that by penalizing the people who come, who may or may not be true refugees, makes absolutely no sense. Of course, the problem is that the criminal enforcement against these groups is very, very difficult. The people really standing behind the smuggling networks are abroad, and the people who are bringing them on boats are generally paid. They may be terrible enforcers on the boat, so people are afraid will not give up their names, or they may be just people who are equally desperate and they were trying to make some money quickly. So you really have a no-win situation in many respects. It's also more curious to some extent because the Canadian government actually has a very regularized immigration system. And the danger here is that these mass arrivals might undermine the entire immigration project in Canada. I don't think it's coming to this point. The Canadian government seems to be able to forestall this from happening, at least at this point. But if you see more of these boatloads, larger numbers of people coming more regularly in the course of a year, I would not be surprised if we started to see the same kind of anti-immigration, anti-refugee movements that we've seen in Australia, New Zealand, and to some extent the United States.
And I understand some opponents of the new policy regarding mass arrivals say it violates human rights. Would you agree with that?
It's a very difficult question because the issue really is what rights do refugees have. And we, of course, have a refugee protection system, but it's a system that was really based on post-World War II refugees. So you're protecting people who have a particular political opinion, although the term political opinion has changed over time. It is not narrow party politics anymore. Then the next question is, why is it that economic constraints do not count? Well, they didn't matter post-World War II. I mean, we worried about religious persecution, ethnic persecution, political persecution, but we did not worry about economic persecution. That was not an issue at that point in time, so it wasn't included. You also now see large displacement of populations because of natural catastrophe, a lot of it triggered by global warming. Now, of course, again, while the Western world is probably largely responsible for it, it will not take responsibility in the sense of saying, well, we're opening up the country to let you come in. And of course, Canada now doesn't have geographic restrictions in the sense of many other countries where you talk about overpopulation, overuse of resources. But these, I think, are the big issues that are driving this. So yes, you can surely make a legal argument that the idea of detaining refugees, especially true refugees, is preposterous and violates human rights norms. On the other hand, we have to come up with systems that allow us to tackle the overarching problem. And I think there is no political will anywhere in the world to do that.
And how do Canadian immigration laws and policies ultimately impact the United States?
Actually, right now, I think they impact the United States in the reverse way. Although we have had a few situations where people who were granted immigrant status in Canada or even citizenship status in Canada came to the United States with the ostensible purpose of committing terrorism offenses or other crimes. What you largely see is people who are not getting legalized status in the United States trying to go to Canada to argue for refugee status there. Now, the northern border is a border that we tend to forget. It's the southern border we focus most of our resources on, although lately there have been many more reports of heavy police enforcement and immigration enforcement along the northern border, where people will be pulled off trains or regularly asked on trains that are straddling the US-Canadian border whether they are citizens, what their legal status is in this country. You also see more detention facilities along the northern border. And so there is quite a bit of immigration enforcement. Now, one thing that we should also be aware of is that U.S. citizens have run afoul of immigration authorities in Canada because of prior criminal records. Canada also will not let American citizens enter who have certain types of criminal records, and this does not mean particularly serious ones in many cases. So that's something American citizens should just be aware of.
And you mentioned criminal law, which is another one of your areas of expertise. How else does immigration law intersect with criminal law?
I mean, one is the allegation that a lot of immigrants, especially undocumented immigrants, commit crime when they come to the United States. Now, undeniably, there is a small group of people who goes to a foreign country with the goal of committing offenses. But the vast number of immigrants comes with a hope of economic gain or personal gain in the sense of family unification, for example. Now, some of these immigrants have real difficulties becoming integrated into the country and then often fall into gangs, criminal groups, or they may be committing, they're not, as a criminal defense lawyer once said to me, they're not bad people, but they're committing something that's a criminal offense. It may be a DUI, it may be turnstile jumping in New York City, it may be an assault, the typical bar fight that may happen, a school fight. That can be classified as an assault and you can be convicted of that. Now, for immigrants, that can have huge consequences. An assault, for example, is a crime of violence that makes you deportable. Now, if you have an American citizen and a permanent resident getting into a fight at school, they both get convicted of assault, independent of the consequences in terms of if they both get probation, nothing else will happen to the U.S. citizen, assuming that he or she fills the probation requirements. The permanent resident alien can actually be deported for that offense and maybe deported many years after the conviction. And I think that's really one of the major areas of interplay. And there's just now studies coming out. What are the ramifications then for the families? Some of these young people, and oftentimes it's younger people who come into contact with the criminal justice system, do not speak their home country's law. Many of them were very young when they left their home country, have no connection to it, and are now being set back by American authorities. That clearly has foreign policy consequences for the United States. It has family ramifications, and it has incredible consequences for that individual. So you really see now, coming full circle, how to some extent it is really important that the federal government enforces immigration law rather than the states. There's enough disparity already coming in through individual criminal law enforcement between the states. If you now add the overlay of very different immigration law enforcement, you're really coming up with a country that has 50 different ways of dealing with immigrants.